The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Silver Creek, Montana, 1875. But Theresa Turner barely flinched as she steadied her father's old Winchester rifle against her shoulder. The empty tin can flew off the fence post, joining a row of its fallen companions. At 22, Theresa had grown accustomed to the whispers that followed her through town plain, unwanted, destined for spinsterhood. With her unruly auburn hair, freckled skin, and practical manner of dress, she was everything the frontier town didn't value in a woman. "Decent shot," came a gruff voice from behind. Theresa spun around, rifle still gripped in her calloused hands. A tall stranger stood at the edge of her property, his hat tipped low over his eyes. Dust covered his denim pants and his boots were worn from long rides. "This is private property," she said firmly, not lowering her weapon. Since her father's passing 3 months ago, leaving her the modest ranch and all its troubles, strangers meant nothing but problems. The man raised his hands slowly. "Zachary Moss, madam. New ranch hand at the Silverton spread." He gestured toward the neighboring property. "Shortcut to town passes through this back field." Old Man Turner never minded. "Old Man Turner is dead," Theresa replied, finally lowering the rifle but keeping her stance rigid. "And his daughter minds very much." Zachary Moss removed his hat, revealing sun-bleached hair and eyes the color of a summer sky, piercing and direct. He studied her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, not with fear, but with self-consciousness. Theresa knew what men saw when they looked at her, nothing worth seeing at all. "My apologies, Miss Turner. I'll take the long way around next time." He nodded respectfully and turned to leave. "Wait," Theresa called, surprising herself. "My father did allow Silverton Hands passage. I suppose I can honor that arrangement?" She hesitated. "Just make yourself known. I don't take kindly to being startled." A smile broke across his tanned face, transforming his rugged features into something almost handsome. "Much obliged, Miss Turner." "Theresa," she corrected automatically, then wondered why she'd offered such familiarity to a stranger. "Theresa," he repeated, and something in his tone made the common name sound different to her ears. "You have a good eye. Better than most men I've ridden with." Before she could respond, he had replaced his hat and continued toward town, leaving Theresa standing in the afternoon sun, wondering why her heart was beating so quickly. The next morning found Theresa in town, leading her wagon through the crowded main street of Silver Creek. Market day always brought the surrounding ranchers and their wives into the dusty frontier settlement, and Theresa kept her head down as she navigated through the crowds. She needed supplies, and to inquire about extending her bank loan, the ranch was hanging by a thread financially since her father's death. "If it isn't the Turner girl," came the sharp voice of Millicent Waters, the mayor's wife and self-appointed arbitrator of local society. She stood with her daughter Violet and 2 other well-dressed women outside the general store. "I heard you were still trying to run that ranch all by yourself. Such a shame." Theresa nodded politely but kept moving. She'd learned long ago that engaging with Millicent only invited more ridicule. "My Wilbur says that property will be up for auction by winter," Millicent continued, raising her voice to ensure Theresa heard. "Perhaps then someone qualified can make something of it." "Someone with a husband," added Violet with a titter that the other women echoed. Theresa tightened her grip on the reins but maintained her pace. Her father had built that ranch from nothing, and she'd be damned if she'd let it go without a fight husband or no husband. At the bank, things went as poorly as expected. Mr. Hargrove, the banker, barely looked at her as he denied her request for additional time. "Miss Turner, I've extended your loan twice already out of respect for your father. But a woman alone cannot manage a cattle operation. It simply isn't done." "I've brought in 3/4 of the herd already," Theresa argued. "I need just 6 more weeks to round up the rest and get them to market." "And how do you propose to manage that? Your father had 4 ranch hands." You have none. Hargrove shuffled papers on his desk, clearly considering the conversation finished. I'll hire help for the roundup. With what money, Miss Turner? You can barely make your current payments. Theresa left the bank with a heavy heart and an even heavier burden. She had 6 weeks to save her home and her father's legacy, but no means to do so. As she loaded supplies into her wagon, a commotion erupted further down the street. A group of cowboys from the larger ranches had gathered outside the saloon, their voices rising in anger. Theresa recognized the source of the conflict immediately. Zachary Moss stood in the center, his posture tense but controlled as 3 men confronted him. I don't take kindly to being called a cheat, Burke, Zachary was saying, his voice carrying down the street. And I don't take kindly to newcomers winning 3 hands in a row, replied a burly man Theresa knew as one of the Hammond Ranch foremen, a mean drunk with a reputation for violence. Then perhaps you should learn to play better, Zachary replied evenly. The crowd laughed, which only inflamed Burke further. He lunged forward, but Zachary sidestepped smoothly, causing Burke to stumble into the dirt. The crowd's laughter grew louder. Burke clambered to his feet, face purple with rage and humiliation. You're dead, Moss, he snarled, reaching for his pistol. What happened next occurred so quickly that Theresa almost missed it. Zachary's hand moved in a blur, drawing and cocking his revolver before Burke's had even cleared its holster. The crowd fell silent. I didn't come here looking for trouble, Zachary said quietly, his gun steady. But I'll finish it if you insist. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Burke slowly raised his hands. Another day, he muttered, backing away. Zachary holstered his weapon and turned to walk away, catching sight of Theresa watching from beside her wagon. Their eyes met briefly before he tipped his hat and disappeared into the saloon. The encounter left Theresa unsettled. Zachary Moss was clearly more than just a ranch hand. His draw had been too fast, too practiced. Such men brought trouble, and trouble was the last thing she needed. As she climbed onto her wagon, she overheard 2 men talking nearby. That's Zachary Moss, all right. Used to ride with the Rangers down in Texas before taking up with that marshal out of Denver. What's a man like that doing working as a hired hand? Heard he got shot up bad last year. Doctor told him to find quiet work for a spell. Theresa flicked the reins and guided her wagon out of town, her mind racing. A former Texas Ranger working as a ranch hand at Silverton. It seemed improbable, yet something about Zachary Moss had struck her as unusual from their first meeting. There was a watchfulness about him, an awareness that spoke of more than just cowboy experience. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the rider approaching from the south road. When she finally noticed, she pulled her wagon to a stop, recognizing the lean figure and dappled gray horse. Miss Turner, Zachary called as he drew alongside her wagon. Heading back to your place? Theresa nodded cautiously. Mr. Moss, I see you've made quite an impression in town already. A wry smile crossed his face. Not the one I was hoping for, I assure you. And what impression were you hoping for? That of a gunslinger? Former, he corrected, his smile fading. I hung up that life when I took the job at Silverton. Theresa studied him for a moment. I heard you were a ranger. Word travels fast in Silver Creek, he said with a sigh. Yes, madam. 4 years with the Rangers, then 2 with a federal marshal. But that's behind me now. Is it? She challenged. Because that didn't look like a man who's hung up his guns back there. Zachary's expression hardened slightly. Self-defense isn't the same as looking for trouble. Burke would have shot me in the back if I'd walked away. They continued in silence for a moment, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the steady rhythm of hooves on the dusty road. I could help you, Zachary said suddenly. Pardon? With your ranch. I couldn't help overhearing at the bank. He had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. You need hands for a roundup. Theresa bristled. I don't need charity, Mr. Moss. It's not charity. It's a business proposition. I've got experience, and Silverton only has me doing odd jobs until the fall drive. I've got time. And why would you want to help me? Zachary met her gaze directly. Because I admire grit, Miss Turner, and you've got more of it than most men I've known. Theresa turned away, uncomfortable with both his scrutiny and his praise. No one had ever accused her of being admirable before. Plain, stubborn, difficult. These were the words that followed her. I can't pay you, she admitted. Not until after the cattle sell. A percentage of the sale then. 10%. She laughed bitterly. After the bank takes its share, there might not be much left. Then I don't have much to lose, do I? His easy confidence both irritated and intrigued her. What do you say, Miss Turner? Partners? Theresa knew she should refuse. A single woman working closely with a man like Zachary Moss would only fuel the town gossip. Yet what choice did she have? The ranch would fail without help, and no one else had offered. I rise at dawn, she said finally. Work starts at first light. Zachary grinned, and for a moment, Theresa caught a glimpse of what he might have been before life hardened him young. Hopeful, perhaps even carefree. I'll be there, he promised. True to his word, Zachary arrived at the Turner Ranch before sunrise the next morning. Theresa was already in the barn, mending tack and preparing for the day's work, when she heard the approaching hoofbeats. You're early, she called out as he entered the barn, leading his gray horse. Always have been a morning person, he replied, removing his hat and gloves. Habit from ranger days. Early rider catches the outlaws, or something like that. Despite herself, Theresa smiled. Well, there are no outlaws here, Mr. Moss. Just stubborn cattle that need rounding up from the north pastures. Zachary, he corrected gently. If we're working together, Mr. Moss sounds too formal. Theresa hesitated, then nodded. Zachary, then. They worked side by side that morning, Theresa explaining the layout of the ranch and the challenges they faced. The Turner property was modest compared to operations like Silverton or the Hammond Ranch, but it boasted good grazing land and clean water sources. My father built this place from nothing, she explained as they rode the boundaries. Came out here in '55 with just a wagon and a dream. He did well, Zachary observed, surveying the rolling grasslands. This is prime cattle country. It was, Theresa agreed, her expression clouding. Until the drought 2 years ago, and then the fever that took half our herd last spring. By the time Pa died, we were already struggling. But you stayed. She looked at him, surprised by the question. Of course I stayed. This is my home. They rode in companionable silence for a while, Theresa pointing out the landmarks that define the property boundaries. By midday, they had reached the northern pastures, where the majority of the remaining cattle grazed. About 70 head here, Zachary estimated, surveying the scattered animals. Good stock, too. You'll get a fair price if we can get them to market in good condition. That's what I've been trying to tell the bank, Theresa said with frustration. But Mr. Hargrove sees a woman and assumes incompetence. His loss, Zachary said simply. I've known many competent women in my time, some better with a ranch than any man. Theresa looked at him sharply, searching for mockery, but found none. Most men don't share that view. Most men are fools, he replied with a shrug. My mother ran our farm in Kansas for 3 years after my father died. Kept it going through drought and grasshoppers and everything else the good Lord threw at us. What happened to it? A shadow crossed his face. Raiders during the war, Confederate irregulars. He didn't elaborate, and Theresa didn't press. The war had left scars across the nation, both visible and invisible. They continued working through the afternoon, assessing the herd and making plans for the roundup. Zachary proved knowledgeable about cattle and ranch operations, offering suggestions that Theresa had to admit were sound. By the time they returned to the ranch house, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. "Thank you for your help today," Theresa said formally as they unsaddled their horses. "Just getting started," Zachary replied. "We'll need at least 2 more hands for a proper roundup. I know some reliable men who might be willing to work for a cut of the proceeds." "I can't afford. They'll take the same deal I did," he interrupted. "A percentage after sale. Trust me on this, Theresa. You can't move this many cattle with just the two of us." She wanted to argue, to insist that she could manage on her own as she had been doing, but logic won out over pride. "Very well. But I have final say on who works this ranch." Zachary nodded, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Wouldn't have it any other way, boss." The word boss sounded strange coming from this man who clearly had commanded others in his previous life. Yet there was no resentment in his tone, only a gentle teasing that Theresa wasn't quite sure how to respond to. "Will you stay for supper?" she asked impulsively. "It's nothing fancy, just beans and cornbread, but it's hot." Surprise registered on his face, followed by something that looked almost like pleasure. "I'd be honored, Miss Turner." "Theresa," she corrected, echoing his earlier words. "If we're working together." "Miss Turner sounds too formal." His slow smile did something peculiar to her insides, creating a fluttering sensation she chose to ignore. "Theresa it is then." Over the next week, Zachary brought 2 more hands to the Turner Ranch brothers named Lucas and Eli Parker, who had worked cattle drives throughout the territory. They were quiet, competent men who treated Theresa with respectful deference that she found refreshing after the condescension she usually encountered. The days fell into a rhythm of hard work from dawn to dusk. They began gathering cattle from the far pastures, slowly moving them toward the home ranch where they could be sorted and prepared for the drive to market. Each evening, the men would retire to the bunkhouse while Theresa returned to the main house, exhausted but satisfied with their progress. Zachary often stayed behind, helping with additional chores or simply sitting on the porch talking as darkness fell. Despite her initial reservations, Theresa found herself looking forward to these quiet conversations. Zachary spoke of his travels across the West, his time with the Rangers, and occasionally, his childhood in Kansas. He never pressed Theresa for personal information, but listened attentively when she chose to share stories of her father or her own experiences. "Why did you never marry?" Zachary asked one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Theresa stiffened slightly. "Not for lack of proposals," she said dryly, "though I suspect most men were more interested in my father's land than in me." "I find that hard to believe." She glanced at him, searching for the mockery she expected, but found only genuine curiosity in his expression. "Well, believe it, Mr. Moss. Plain women with opinions aren't highly sought after, even on the frontier." "Who told you that you were plain?" he asked, his voice suddenly serious. Theresa laughed without humor. "No one needed to tell me. I own a mirror." "Then perhaps your mirror is faulty," he said quietly. The statement hung in the air between them, neither willing to pursue its implications. Finally, Theresa stood, smoothing her skirts with nervous hands. "It's getting late. We have an early start tomorrow." Zachary nodded and rose as well, replacing his hat. "Good night, Theresa." As she watched him walk toward the bunkhouse, Theresa felt a confusing mixture of emotions she couldn't quite name. She told herself it was simply gratitude for his help, combined with the relief of knowing her ranch might yet be saved. Anything else would be foolish to contemplate. The following Saturday, Theresa ventured into town for supplies and to update Mr. Hargrove on her progress. The banker listened with obvious skepticism to her report, but grudgingly agreed to wait until after the cattle sale before making any decisions about foreclosure. As she exited the bank, Theresa nearly collided with Millicent Waters and her daughter Violet, who were just entering. Miss Turner, Millicent said with false warmth, I heard you've hired hands for your little ranch. How progressive of you. Good afternoon, Mrs. Waters, Miss Waters, Theresa replied politely, attempting to move past them. I also heard one of them is that handsome new fellow from Silverton, Violet added, her perfectly arranged curls bouncing as she tilted her head. The one who used to be some sort of lawman. Is that true? Theresa maintained her composure. Mr. Moss has been kind enough to assist with the roundup, yes. How generous of him, Millicent said with a knowing look that made Theresa's cheeks burn. A single man helping a single woman. People are talking, my dear. People always talk, Mrs. Waters, Theresa replied evenly. I've found it best not to listen. She pushed past them and continued down the street, her back straight despite the humiliation burning through her. The Waters women were not the first to insinuate impropriety, nor would they be the last. Silver Creek thrived on gossip, and a woman alone provided endless fodder. Theresa was so distracted by the encounter that she didn't notice Burke and two of his Hammond Ranch companions until they blocked her path near the general store. Well, if it isn't the cattle queen herself, Burke sneered, his breath reeking of whiskey despite the early hour. How's your pet gunslinger working out? Excuse me, Theresa said firmly, attempting to step around them. Burke moved to block her path. Not so fast, Miss Turner. I'm curious about your arrangement with Moss. Must be special for a man like that to sign on with a failing ranch run by a spinster. My arrangements with my employees are none of your concern, Theresa replied, her hand sliding into her pocket where she kept a small derringer. Her father had taught her never to go unarmed, even in town. Oh, I think they are, Burke said, stepping closer. See, Hammond doesn't appreciate Silverton hands moonlighting on other spreads. Bad for business. Mr. Moss is free to work where he chooses. Burke laughed unpleasantly. Is that what you call it? Working? The innuendo was unmistakable, and Theresa felt her face flush with anger rather than embarrassment. Before she could respond, however, a new voice interrupted. Problem here, gentlemen? Sheriff Wilson had appeared behind Burke, his weathered face set in a frown. Though well into his 60s, the sheriff remained an imposing figure who commanded respect even from troublemakers like Burke. No problem, Sheriff, Burke muttered, stepping back. Just having a friendly chat with Miss Turner. Didn't look friendly to me, the sheriff observed mildly. Miss Turner, can I escort you somewhere? Grateful for the intervention, Theresa allowed the sheriff to walk her to the general store, where she completed her purchases under his watchful eye. You should be careful, Theresa, Sheriff Wilson said as he helped load her supplies into the wagon. Burke's got a mean streak, especially when he's been drinking. I can handle Burke, Theresa assured him. Maybe so, but these days you're giving him extra reason to cause trouble. The sheriff's expression was kind but concerned. Having Zachary Moss working for you has ruffled some feathers. There's history there you might not know about. Theresa frowned. What kind of history? Burke and Moss crossed paths down in Colorado a few years back. Burke was running with a rough crowd then, before Hammond hired him. Moss was still marshalling. The sheriff shook his head. Let's just say Burke has reason to hold a grudge. This new information troubled Theresa. Zachary had never mentioned knowing Burke before their confrontation in town. What else might he be keeping from her? The ride back to the ranch gave Theresa ample time to consider the sheriff's words and the veiled threats from Burke. By the time she arrived, her mood had darkened considerably. She found Zachary mending fence near the corral, his sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned, muscular forearms as he worked. You're back earlier than expected, he called as she approached, his smile fading when he saw her expression. What happened? You tell me, she said, crossing her arms. What's your history with Burke from Hammond Ranch? Zachary's face betrayed nothing as he set down his tools and straightened. Who's been talking? Sheriff Wilson. He seemed to think I should know that my ranch hand has a personal enemy who might cause trouble. A muscle worked in Zachary's jaw as he considered his response. It's not relevant to our arrangement. It is if it puts my ranch at risk, Theresa countered. I deserve to know what I'm dealing with. Zachary was silent for a long moment, then gestured toward the shade of a nearby oak. Let's sit. It's not a short story. Once settled, he removed his hat and ran a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. 3 years ago, I was working with Marshall Collins out of Denver. We were tracking a gang that had robbed 3 banks across Colorado. Burke was riding with them. Burke was an outlaw? Theresa asked, surprised despite herself. Among other things, we caught up with them near Pueblo. In the fight that followed, I shot the gang leader Burke's cousin. Zachary's expression darkened. Burke got away in the confusion. Most of the others were either killed or captured. And he blames you for his cousin's death. Zachary nodded. When I saw him in town that day, it was the first time since Pueblo. I wasn't sure he recognized me at first, but the card game made it clear he did. Why didn't you tell me this before? Theresa demanded, anger mixing with concern. Because it's my problem, not yours. I didn't want to burden you with more troubles. It became my problem the moment you signed on here, she retorted. Today, Burke threatened me in town, implied that Hammond Ranch doesn't appreciate you working for me. Alarm flashed across Zachary's face. Did he hurt you? No. Sheriff Wilson intervened. Theresa shook her head in frustration. But this changes things. I can't have Hammond Ranch as an enemy. They're too powerful in this territory. I'll leave, Zachary said immediately. Tonight. That should solve the problem. No. The vehemence in her own voice startled Theresa. More moderately, she continued. No, that wouldn't solve anything. The roundup is half done. Without you, I'd lose everything anyway. Zachary studied her face. What do you propose then? We continue as planned, Theresa decided. But no more secrets, Zachary. I need to know what and who I'm dealing with. He nodded slowly. No more secrets, he agreed, though something in his expression made Theresa wonder if he was still holding something back. As they rose to return to work, Zachary placed a gentle hand on her arm. I'm sorry, Theresa. The last thing I wanted was to bring trouble to your door. The sincerity in his voice, coupled with the warmth of his touch, sent an unexpected thrill through Theresa. She stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. Just help me get these cattle to market, she said briskly. That's all I ask. But as she walked away, Theresa knew she was lying to herself. Somewhere along the way, Zachary Moss had become more than just a hired hand to her. The realization was as unwelcome as it was undeniable. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity as they completed the roundup and began preparing for the drive to the railhead at Junction City, nearly 60 miles east. The work was exhausting, but satisfying, and despite the tension following their conversation about Burke, Theresa and Zachary settled back into their efficient partnership. One evening, as they finished the day's work, Lucas Parker approached Theresa with news that changed everything. Miss Turner, my brother and I were in town for supplies today. Thought you should know Hammond Ranch is planning a drive to Junction City. They're leaving tomorrow. Theresa felt her stomach drop. Tomorrow? They weren't supposed to move their herd until next week. Lucas nodded grimly. That's what everyone thought. But they've gathered hands from all over the county and are pushing out early. Word is, Burke's in charge of the drive. Zachary, who had been listening nearby, joined them. If Hammond gets their cattle to market before us, they'll drive down the prices. Buyers won't pay premium for your stock if Hammond floods the market first. We're not ready, Theresa said, calculating quickly. We need at least 3 more days to finish preparations. We don't have 3 days, Zachary replied. We need to leave at first light tomorrow if we want any chance of beating them to Junction City. Theresa looked between the Parker brothers and Zachary, reading the determination in their faces. These men had tied their fortunes to hers, working for a promise of payment that would never materialize if Hammond beat them to market. First light it is, she decided. Let's make it happen. The night was spent in frantic preparation, gathering supplies, checking equipment, ensuring the herd was ready for the long journey. Theresa worked alongside the men, ignoring exhaustion as they readied the chuck wagon and organized the drive. As dawn broke, nearly 80 head of cattle were already moving east, with Zachary and the Parker brothers flanking the herd while Theresa drove the supply wagon. It was a small outfit compared to the Hammond drive they were racing against, but they had the advantage of a head start and a more direct route. The first 2 days passed without incident, the cattle moving at a steady pace across the rolling grasslands. Theresa found herself falling into the rhythm of the drive, taking her turn at watch during the night and helping with camp duties when they stopped. The men treated her with the same respect they showed each other, accepting her authority without question. On the third night, as they camped near a small creek, Zachary joined Theresa by the fire after the others had retired. "You're good at this," he observed, pouring coffee from the pot kept warm at the edge of the flames. Most experienced drovers would struggle to maintain this pace. Theresa accepted the cup he offered. "My father took me on my first cattle drive when I was 14. Said a Turner should know every aspect of the business." He was right. Zachary settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence in the cool night air. "You would have made him proud." "I hope so," she replied softly. "This ranch was everything to him." "And to you?" Theresa considered the question. "It's all I've ever known. All I've ever wanted." "Nothing else?" Zachary's voice was casual, but his eyes were intent as they reflected the dancing firelight. Theresa looked away, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "What else is there for someone like me?" "Someone like you," he repeated thoughtfully. "And what kind of person is that, exactly?" "You know what I mean. Plain, difficult. Not the kind of woman men write poems about or fight duels over." Zachary's laugh was soft and without mockery. "Is that what you want? Poems and duels?" "No, of course not," Theresa said quickly. "I'm just being realistic about my prospects." "Realistic?" Zachary echoed. Interesting word choice from a woman who's single-handedly running a cattle ranch against all odds. Before Theresa could formulate a response, a distant sound caught their attention, the low rumble of many hooves moving across the plains. Zachary was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "Wake the others," he ordered, all trace of warmth gone from his voice. "That's too many cattle to be anything but Hammond's drive." Theresa rushed to rouse Lucas and Eli while Zachary scouted the perimeter of their camp. By the time they regrouped, the sound had grown closer. "They're pushing hard, moving at night," Zachary reported grimly. "Must have cut across Blackwater Ridge to make up time." "Can we outrun them?" Theresa asked, already knowing the answer. Zachary shook his head. "Not with our numbers. They'll overtake us by midday tomorrow at this rate." "Then what do we do?" The three men exchanged glances, and it was Lucas who finally spoke. "There's another route to Junction City, through Serpent Canyon. It's faster but more dangerous. Most outfits avoid it because of the narrow passages. But with a smaller herd like ours," Eli added, "we might manage it." Theresa frowned. "Serpent Canyon has a reputation. Cattle have been lost there." "It's a risk," Zachary acknowledged, "but it's either that or let Hammond beat us to market." The decision weighed heavily on Theresa. Taking the canyon route meant gambling everything on a dangerous passage, yet the alternative meant certain financial ruin. "We'll take the canyon," she decided finally. "But we leave now, under cover of darkness. If Hammond's scouts see us changing course, they'll know what we're planning." The men nodded in agreement, and within an hour they had broken camp and were guiding the herd toward the distant silhouette of the canyon ridgeline. Theresa felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her as they traveled through the darkness, aware that she was risking not only her own future, but the lives of these men who had trusted her. By dawn, they had reached the entrance to Serpent Canyon, a jagged cut through towering sandstone cliffs that wound like its namesake through the otherwise impassable terrain. The cattle were nervous, sensing the unfamiliar territory, but the skilled handling of Zachary and the Parker brothers kept them moving forward. The canyon narrowed as they progressed, forcing them to move the herd in a long, thin line rather than the broader formation they had maintained on the open plains. Progress slowed considerably, and Theresa found herself constantly calculating and recalculating their chances of reaching Junction City before Hammond's Drive. By midday, they had navigated the most treacherous sections of the canyon and were beginning to hope they might emerge unscathed when disaster struck. A rattlesnake, disturbed by the passing cattle, struck at one of the lead steers, causing the animal to bolt in panic. Within moments, the front section of the herd was in full stampede, charging down the narrow canyon with the men in desperate pursuit. Theresa abandoned the chuck wagon and raced on horseback to help contain the stampede. The dust was so thick she could barely see, but she could hear the thundering hooves and the shouts of the men as they attempted to regain control. She circled wide, pushing her horse to its limits to get ahead of the panicked animals. As she rounded a bend in the canyon, Theresa saw Zachary directly in the path of the stampeding cattle, waving his hat and shouting to turn the leaders. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he would be trampled, but then the lead steer veered, and the herd began to turn. Zachary continued working the edge of the stampede, gradually slowing and calming the frightened animals. When the dust finally settled, they assessed the damage. Miraculously, they had lost only 3 steers to the stampede, though several others were injured. More concerning was Zachary's condition during the chaos. He had been struck by a glancing blow from one of the cattle and was now nursing what appeared to be a cracked rib. "It's nothing," he insisted as Theresa examined the angry bruise spreading across his side. "I've had worse." "That doesn't make it nothing," she retorted, carefully wrapping his torso with bandages from the medical supplies in the chuck wagon. "You could have been killed." "Comes with the territory," he said with a grimace that might have been pain or might have been an attempt at a smile. "Cattle driving isn't for the faint of heart. Neither is watching someone you—" Theresa stopped abruptly, realizing what she had been about to say. Zachary's eyes met hers, searching. "Someone you what, Theresa?" She busied herself with securing the bandage, avoiding his gaze. "Someone you rely on," she finished lamely. "We need you to complete this drive." If Zachary was disappointed by her answer, he didn't show it. "Then complete it we will. I'm still perfectly capable of riding." Despite his assurances, Theresa insisted that Zachary take a less physically demanding position for the remainder of the day, allowing his injury time to stabilize. By evening, they had navigated through the remainder of the canyon and emerged onto the eastern plains, with Junction City now just 2 days' ride away. That night, as they made camp, Theresa found herself watching Zachary more closely than usual, noticing the careful way he moved to avoid aggravating his injury and the occasional wince he couldn't quite suppress. The realization of how easily she could have lost him today frightened her in a way that had nothing to do with the success of the cattle drive. After dinner, as Lucas and Eli took the first watch, Theresa approached Zachary where he sat by the fire, methodically cleaning his revolver. "How are you feeling?" she asked, settling beside him. "I'll live," he replied, continuing his task without looking up. "Ribs are starting to stiffen up, but that's to be expected." "Thank you," Theresa said quietly, "for what you did today. It was brave. Foolish, but brave." At this, Zachary finally set aside his weapon and turned to face her. "Not foolish if it worked," he pointed out with a faint smile. "And it did. We're still on track to beat Hammond to market." "Is that all that matters to you?" Winning this race? Zachary's expression grew serious. No, not all. The intensity in his gaze made Theresa's heart race, and she found herself struggling to maintain her composure. What else then? Instead of answering, Zachary reached out slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, warm and calloused from work. "You really don't see it, do you?" he asked softly. "See what?" Theresa's voice was barely a whisper. "How beautiful you are." The words hung between them, impossible to believe, yet impossible to dismiss given the sincerity in his eyes. Theresa felt herself trembling slightly, overwhelmed by emotions she had never allowed herself to acknowledge. "Don't," she managed, though she made no move to pull away from his touch. "Don't say things you don't mean." "I've never said anything I didn't mean," Zachary replied, his thumb gently tracing the curve of her cheekbone. "Not to you." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching riders broke the moment. Zachary was on his feet in an instant, his hand going to his holster despite his injury. Theresa stood as well, straining to see through the darkness as Lucas came running from his watch position. "Riders coming fast from the west," he reported breathlessly. 4, maybe 5 of them. "Hammond's men," Zachary concluded grimly. "They must have realized we took the canyon route and sent a party to intercept us." "What do they want?" Theresa asked, though she already suspected the answer. "To delay us," Zachary said. "Or worse." The approaching riders were visible now, silhouetted against the night sky as they crested a small rise. They slowed as they neared the camp, spreading out in a manner that Theresa recognized as tactical surrounding them. Zachary positioned himself slightly in front of Theresa, his stance protective yet not dismissive of her ability to defend herself. Lucas and Eli joined them, both armed and watchful. As the riders drew closer, Theresa recognized Burke in the lead, his bulky figure unmistakable even in the dim light of the campfire. "Evening, Miss Turner," Burke called, reining in his horse a safe distance from the camp. "Fancy meeting you out here." "This is a strange coincidence, Mr. Burke," Theresa replied evenly. "I thought Hammond Ranch was taking the northern route to Junction City." Burke laughed, a harsh sound in the quiet night. "Oh, they are. Mr. Hammond just thought you might need some assistance. These parts can be dangerous for a small outfit." "We're managing fine," Zachary said, his voice deceptively calm. "Your concern is noted, but unnecessary." Burke's attention shifted to Zachary, his expression hardening. "Moss. Still playing cowboy, I see. How's that working out for you?" "Better than playing outlaw worked for your cousin," Zachary replied evenly. The taunt had its intended effect. Burke's face contorted with rage, and he urged his horse forward, stopping only when Zachary's hand settled more visibly on his holstered revolver. "You've got a big mouth for a man outnumbered," Burke snarled. "Yet somehow I like my odds," Zachary replied. "What do you want, Burke? Because if you're here to cause trouble, I suggest you reconsider." Burke glanced at his companions, then back at the small group defending the Turner herd. For a tense moment, Theresa thought he might order an attack, but then he smiled, a cold, calculating expression that chilled her more than his anger had. "No trouble," he said smoothly. "Just passing through. But I'd watch your back trail if I were you, Miss Turner. All sorts of accidents can happen on a cattle drive." With that parting threat, Burke wheeled his horse around and led his men back the way they had come, disappearing into the darkness. "They'll be back," Lucas said grimly once the riders were out of earshot. "Yes," Zachary agreed. "But not tonight. Burke isn't one for fair fights. He'll wait until he has the advantage." "Which means we don't rest until we reach Junction City," Theresa concluded. "We move the herd at first light and push hard." The men nodded in agreement, and they quickly reorganized their watch schedule to ensure maximum vigilance. Theresa insisted that Zachary take the opportunity to rest, given his injury, while she took a watch shift herself. As she sat alone in the darkness, rifle across her lap, Theresa replayed the moment by the fire before Burke's arrival. Zachary had called her beautiful, not just pretty or pleasant, but beautiful. No one had ever described her that way before. The women in town had always made it clear that Theresa fell short of conventional beauty standards with her practical clothing, unruly hair, and sun-darkened skin. Yet the way Zachary had looked at her, there had been no hint of deception in his eyes, only a warmth that made her wonder if perhaps she had been measuring herself against the wrong standards all along. Dawn broke clear and cool, finding the Turner Drive already in motion. They had decided to forego breakfast in favor of an early start, everyone understanding the stakes. Zachary, despite Theresa's protests, was riding flank position, his face tight with pain, but his determination unwavering. They pushed the cattle hard that day, stopping only briefly to rest the animals when absolutely necessary. By late afternoon, the distant silhouette of Junction City was visible on the horizon, a welcome sight that energized their efforts. "We might actually make it," Lucas said during one of their brief stops, his usual stoicism giving way to cautious optimism. "Don't celebrate yet," Zachary warned, scanning the surrounding terrain with watchful eyes. "Burke's still out there somewhere." As if summoned by his words, a rider appeared on a ridge to their east, observing their progress before disappearing again. Zachary immediately called for increased vigilance, positioning the men strategically around the herd. "They're tracking us," he explained to Theresa as they resumed the drive, waiting for the right moment to make their move. "What can they possibly hope to accomplish at this point?" Theresa asked. "We're too close to Junction City for them to stop us now." "They don't need to stop us," Zachary replied grimly. "Just delay us until Hammond's herd arrives, or scatter our cattle to reduce what we can bring to market." Understanding dawned on Theresa. "The river crossing," she said. "That's where they'll make their move." Zachary nodded. "It's the perfect spot. The herd will be vulnerable, and there's limited room to maneuver." The South Fork River lay between them and Junction City, not particularly wide or deep at this time of year, but still a challenging obstacle for a cattle drive. The crossing point was a natural bottleneck where the riverbanks were stable enough for safe passage. As they approached the river in the late afternoon, Theresa could see that her prediction had been correct. Burke and his men were positioned on the far bank, clearly intending to interfere with their crossing. Zachary called a halt just out of earshot of Burke's position and gathered the group to discuss strategy. "We can't risk a confrontation at the crossing," he said. "One gunshot could trigger a stampede, and we'd lose half the herd in the river." "Is there another crossing point?" Theresa asked. Lucas shook his head. "Not for miles in either direction, and trying to find one would give Hammond's drive time to catch up." "Then we need a diversion," Eli suggested. "Something to draw them away from the crossing long enough for us to get the herd through." All eyes turned to Zachary, whose experience with tactical situations made him the natural leader in this crisis. He considered for a moment, then outlined a simple but risky plan. "I'll circle around and approach from the north, make them think I'm a scout from Hammond's drive with urgent news. Should draw at least some of them away from the crossing. Meanwhile, you three push the herd through as quickly as possible." "That's too dangerous," Theresa objected immediately. "Burke wants you dead. If he recognizes you, he won't get close enough to try anything," Zachary assured her. "I just need to create enough confusion to give you time." Despite her misgivings, Theresa couldn't devise a better alternative. Time was against them, and Burke's men held the tactical advantage at the crossing. "Be careful," she said finally, meeting Zachary's gaze with an intensity that conveyed everything she couldn't say aloud. He nodded, understanding. "Get the cattle across. Don't wait for me. I'll find you in Junction City." With that, He mounted his horse and rode north, keeping to the low ground to avoid being spotted by Burke's lookouts. Theresa watched him go with a heavy heart, then turned to the Parker brothers. "Let's move the herd to the edge of the river. We'll wait for Zachary's diversion, then cross as quickly as possible." They positioned the cattle near the riverbank, holding them in place with difficulty as the animals sensed water ahead. Across the river, Burke and his men maintained their positions, occasionally shouting taunts that Theresa steadfastly ignored. Nearly 30 minutes passed with no sign of Zachary's diversion. Theresa was beginning to fear the worst when a column of smoke rose from the north, followed by shouts from Burke's position. "Fire!" one of Burke's men called. "The grass is burning." The diversion worked precisely as Zachary had planned. Burke immediately dispatched 3 of his 5 men to investigate the fire, leaving only himself and one other guard at the crossing. The moment they rode out of sight, Theresa gave the signal to begin the crossing. The cattle entered the water reluctantly at first, then with increasing confidence as the lead steers found solid footing. Lucas and Eli worked tirelessly to keep the herd moving forward, while Theresa brought up the rear, constantly scanning for signs of trouble. They were nearly halfway across when Zachary appeared on the far bank, riding hard toward the crossing with Burke's men in pursuit. He had clearly been recognized and was now leading them away from the herd, drawing their fire in the opposite direction. Theresa watched in horror as Burke himself broke away from the crossing and joined the pursuit, firing his revolver at Zachary's retreating figure. The distance was too great for accuracy, but the danger was unmistakable. "Keep the herd moving," Theresa shouted to the Parker brothers before wheeling her horse around and heading back toward the bank they had just left. She couldn't abandon Zachary to face Burke and his men alone, injured as he was. By the time she reached solid ground, both Zachary and his pursuers had disappeared into a stand of cottonwoods along the riverbank. Gunshots echoed from the trees, followed by silence that frightened Theresa more than the gunfire had. She approached cautiously, rifle ready, using the scattered trees for cover. As she neared the cottonwood stand, she heard the sound of horses moving away at speed, Burke's men retreating, but no sign of Zachary. "Zachary?" she called, keeping her voice low. "Zachary, are you there?" A groan from behind a fallen log answered her. Theresa rushed forward to find Zachary slumped against the deadfall, blood staining his shirt just below his left shoulder. "You were supposed to cross with the herd," he said through gritted teeth as she knelt beside him. "And you were supposed to be careful," she retorted, examining the wound with trembling hands. "Can you ride?" "Have to, don't I?" He attempted a smile that turned into a grimace of pain. "Burke's men will be back once they realize I've stopped running." Theresa helped him to his feet and onto his horse, then mounted her own. "The herd?" "Safe on the other side by now," Zachary confirmed. "Lucas and Eli know what they're doing." They rode toward Junction City as quickly as Zachary's condition allowed, taking a circuitous route to avoid any further encounters with Burke's men. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, night had fallen, and Zachary was swaying dangerously in his saddle from blood loss and exhaustion. Theresa took him directly to the doctor's house, pounding on the door until the sleepy physician answered. While the doctor treated Zachary's wound a bullet graze that looked worse than it was, thanks to his already weakened condition from the earlier rib injury, Theresa went to find Lucas and Eli. She located them at the cattle pens near the railroad yard, where they had successfully corralled the Turner herd. Despite the harrowing river crossing, they had lost only a few head, and the cattle were in excellent condition for market. "Moss?" Lucas asked as soon as he saw her. "With the doctor. He'll be all right." Theresa surveyed the pens with satisfaction. "Any sign of Hammond's drive?" Eli shook his head. "Nothing yet. Word in town is they're still a day out at least." Relief washed over Theresa. They had done it, beaten Hammond to market against impossible odds. Her father's ranch would survive. The next morning, Theresa negotiated with cattle buyers while the Parker brothers guarded the herd. The prices were better than she had dared hope, with buyers eager to secure stock before Hammond's larger herd arrived. By noon, she had sold every animal at premium rates and was carrying a bank draft that would not only clear her debt but leave enough capital to rebuild her breeding stock. Her first stop after the bank was the doctor's house, where she found Zachary sitting up in bed, looking pale but alert. The doctor had confirmed that with proper rest he would make a full recovery. "We did it," Theresa told him, unable to contain her smile. "The cattle sold for top dollar. The ranch is safe." Zachary's answering smile lit his entire face. "I never doubted you for a moment." "Liar," she teased, settling into the chair beside his bed. "There were plenty of moments of doubt. For both of us." "Maybe a few," he conceded. "But here we are." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the victory still fresh and sweet between them. "I need to ask you something," Theresa said finally, gathering her courage. "What you said by the campfire, before Burke arrived. Did you mean it?" Zachary held her gaze steadily. "Every word." "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "Why me? I'm not—" "If you say you're not beautiful one more time, I might have to do something drastic," Zachary interrupted, his voice gentle despite the warning. "You are the most beautiful woman I've ever known, Theresa Turner, not because of your face or your figure, though both are lovely, but because of your spirit, your determination, your heart." Theresa felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. "You barely know me." "I know enough," he replied simply. "I know you're brave enough to face down a town full of gossips and a banker determined to take your home. I know you're skilled enough to run a ranch that men said you couldn't handle. I know you're loyal enough to risk your life for a wounded ranch hand when you could have saved yourself." He reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "I know that from the moment I saw you on your property with that rifle. Something in me recognized something in you. And I've been falling in love with you every day since." The words hung in the air between them, both terrifying and exhilarating. Theresa had never allowed herself to imagine hearing such a declaration, had never believed it possible that someone like Zachary Moss could see her as worthy of love. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to say anything," Zachary assured her. "I'm not expecting—" "I love you too," Theresa interrupted, the words rushing out before she could reconsider. "I think I've loved you since you stood in my field and called my shooting decent with that insufferable confidence." Zachary laughed, then winced as the movement jarred his injured shoulder. "I was trying to be impressive. You terrified me with that rifle." "Good," Theresa said, smiling through the tears that had finally escaped. "It's about time someone was impressed by me." "I'm more than impressed," Zachary said softly, tugging her hand to draw her closer. "I'm captivated." When their lips met, Theresa felt as though every moment of her life, every struggle, every disappointment, every triumph had been leading to this. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepening with a passion that surprised and delighted her. When they finally parted, both breathless, Zachary's eyes were bright with emotion and future possibilities. "So what happens now, Miss Turner?" Theresa considered the question seriously. "The ranch still needs work. And a foreman, if you're interested in a permanent position." "I might be," he replied with a slow smile. "Though I was hoping for a title with a bit more permanence than foreman." "Were you now?" Theresa arched an eyebrow, trying to maintain her composure despite the joy bubbling up inside her. "And what title did you have in mind, Mr. Moss?" "Husband," he said simply, "if you'll have me." The word sent a thrill through Theresa unlike anything she had ever experienced. Marriage had always seemed like an impossibility for her, something other women achieved, but never plain, difficult Theresa Turner. Yet here was Zachary Moss, looking at her as though she were the most precious thing in his world, offering her his heart and his future without reservation. "Yes," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her voice despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Yes, I'll have you." Zachary pulled her close again, sealing their agreement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of partnership, respect, and love. When they separated, he was grinning like a man who had just won the greatest prize imaginable. "The town gossips are going to have a field day with this," Theresa remarked, though she found she no longer cared what Millicent Waters or anyone else thought of her. "Let them talk," Zachary said with a shrug. "It won't change what we know." "And what's that?" His expression softened as he gazed at her. "That they called you plain and unwanted. But to this cowboy, you're the only beauty I see." 3 months later, Theresa Turner became Theresa Moss in a simple ceremony at the Silver Creek Church. The town turned out in force for the event, curiosity overcoming any lingering disapproval of the match. Even Millicent Waters attended, though her smile was strained as she congratulated the bride. The Turner Ranch, now the Turner Moss Ranch, flourished under their joint management. Zachary's experience complemented Theresa's knowledge of the land, and together they built the operation into one of the most respected in the territory. The Parker brothers stayed on as permanent hands, joined by others as the ranch expanded. Hammond Ranch never again attempted to interfere with their business after Burke's disgrace. Following the failed attempt to disrupt the Turner Drive, Burke had returned to Junction City and gotten into a drunken altercation that ended with him being arrested by the local sheriff. Mr. Hammond, unwilling to associate with such behavior, had publicly disavowed him. 1 year to the day after their wedding, Theresa and Zachary stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, the same view that had witnessed their first honest conversation about feelings neither had expected to discover. "Any regrets?" Zachary asked, his arm around his wife's waist. Theresa leaned into his embrace, her hand resting protectively over the gentle swell of her stomach where their first child was growing. "Not a single one. Not even marrying a broken-down ex-lawman with more scars than sense." She turned to face him, reaching up to trace the faint line that marked his left cheekbone, a souvenir from some long-ago fight. "Especially not that part. Though I do wish you'd stop describing yourself that way." Zachary smiled, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "As you wish, Mrs. Moss." "Better," she approved. "Much better." As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, talking of the future, the child they would welcome in the spring, the plans for expanding the herd, the life they were building together. A life neither had imagined possible before fate and circumstance brought them together on a struggling ranch in Silver Creek, Montana. The woman the town had called plain and unwanted had found her place and her purpose, not by changing to meet others' expectations, but by being exactly who she was. And in doing so, she had found the one man who saw her true beauty from the very beginning. 5 years later, the Turner Moss Ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous in the territory. Their home, once a simple cabin, had been expanded to accommodate their growing family. 4-year-old James and 2-year-old Clara filled the rooms with laughter and energy that seemed boundless. On a crisp autumn morning, Theresa stood in the doorway watching Zachary teach little James to ride his first pony, the scene filling her heart with contentment. Clara clung to her skirts, still too young for riding lessons but determined to follow her brother in all things. "Mama, when can I ride?" she asked for perhaps the 100th time that week. "When you're a bit taller, my love," Theresa replied, smoothing the child's dark curls so like her father's. "For now, you can help me with the chickens." This compromise satisfied Clara momentarily, and she happily followed her mother to the henhouse, chattering about the eggs they would collect and the biscuits they would make. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Theresa and Zachary sat by the fire in their comfortable parlor. These quiet moments together had become precious in their busy lives, time set aside to reconnect and share the day's events. "I saw Millicent Waters in town today," Theresa mentioned as she mended one of James's shirts. "She actually smiled at me. A real smile, not one of those pinched expressions she usually manages." Zachary chuckled, looking up from the ledger where he was reviewing their accounts. Wonders never cease. What prompted this miracle? Apparently, her daughter Violet is finally engaged. To a banker from Denver, no less. Theresa set aside her sewing. "Millicent couldn't resist telling me all about it, how handsome he is. How wealthy. How perfect for her precious Violet. And this made you happy because—" Zachary raised an eyebrow, knowing his wife too well to believe she took pleasure in Millicent's continued pretensions. "Because for the first time," Theresa explained, moving to sit beside him on the sofa, "I didn't feel even a flicker of envy or inadequacy. I just felt genuinely pleased for Violet and slightly sorry for Millicent, who still measures success by such limited standards." Zachary wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "You've come a long way from the woman who couldn't accept a compliment without arguing." "I had a good teacher," she replied, nestling against him, "someone who saw beyond the surface." "I just saw what was always there," he said simply. "The rest of the world was blind." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire and enjoying the rare quiet. "Do you ever miss it?" Theresa asked suddenly. "The excitement of your former life? The danger?" Zachary considered the question seriously, as he did all things. "Sometimes I miss the clarity of purpose," he admitted. "Tracking outlaws is straightforward in a way that raising children isn't." They both laughed at this understatement. "But no," he continued, his voice softening, "I don't miss the loneliness, the constant moving, the knowledge that there was nothing permanent in my life. This," he gestured to encompass their home, their life together. "This is everything I never knew I wanted until I found it." Theresa tilted her face up to his, still sometimes amazed that this man had chosen her, loved her, built a life with her. Even with all the challenges, the drought last year, the trouble with the Hendersons' boundary dispute, Clara's endless questions? "Especially with those things," Zachary replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she loved. "Life isn't about avoiding challenges, Theresa. It's about facing them with the right person by your side." As their lips met in a kiss that still held all the passion of their early days together, Theresa reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a lonely woman defending her father's legacy to a wife, mother, and respected rancher, she had transformed not by changing who she was, but by embracing it fully. The townspeople no longer whispered about plain, unwanted Theresa Turner. Now they spoke with respect about the Turner Moss Ranch and the strong partnership that had built it. Some even pointed to their marriage as an example of what was possible when two people recognized each other's true worth. But none of that external validation mattered as much as the knowledge Theresa carried in her heart that she had found a man who saw her beauty when no one else did, who valued her strength when others found it intimidating, who loved her completely for exactly who she was. And in loving her, he had taught her to see herself through his eyes, not as the plain, unwanted woman she had believed herself to be, but as the only beauty he would ever need to see.